start this other microphone. Can you hear me? All right. Super. No? Maybe even better. Anyway, I'm trying to speak up then. Can you hear me this way?
Yes.
Yes. So, I think I'm going to stand here so that I can reach the mouse. But then I lose my water. It's too hard. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Nadia and Attila, for inviting me. I've been told in no uncertain terms that I shall present something on socialism and world history today, and do that in less than 40 minutes. Interesting challenge. So I'll do my best along those lines. The only twist is, some of you may have heard me talk about similar issues before. I've also published things like this. What I'm going to present today is brand new. It's so new that I barely finished putting together the slides this afternoon. So it's really my most recent kind of interest. The reason I'm saying this is partly to beg for your forgiveness, and partly to signal that it's very rough around the edges. So I know that. But I hope that it'll at least perform its function, which is to warm you up for Professor Kagavitsky's talk. I think this is what I'm going to do. There. So, after Ghana's independence, achieved in 1957, the capital city, Accra, had a sudden housing crisis. Having spent 2 weeks there in late 1959 on what he called a reconnaissance tour before his appointment as Nigerian commissioner to Ghana, a young lawyer by the name Kolawere Palogum found, for instance, that, I quote, one of the biggest problems of any diplomat in Accra, as in many other capital cities, is accommodation. The position was made more difficult by the growing number of embassies descending upon Accra from all parts of the world. Ghana was already free in 1957. It pursued a policy of neutrality between East and West, so ambassadors of both zones of the Cold War made Mecca of Accra. Little wonder rents were sky high. An American journalist writing for the New York Times in 1963 quoted with much amazement and approval the words of a Soviet diplomat overheard at a garden party in Accra, suggesting that Ghana was, and I quote, the most non-aligned capital in the world. It was said with a smile, and Ghanaian officials and diplomats from both sides of the Iron Curtain chuckled knowingly. Then the group drifted apart, and each guest went about the business of noting who was talking with whom, for how long, and why. No one could overlook the fact that the Russians and the Chinese communists took up positions at opposite ends of the lawn, as did the Arabs and the Israelis, and the East Germans and the West Germans. And the Americans avoided the Cubans, and the Cubans, ever since Premier Fidel Castro's visit to Moscow, have been avoiding the Chinese. The Pakistanis nodded too, but did not talk with the Indians. The Ghanaians talked with everyone. Present at such diplomatic events was a Hungarian journalist. And that is so because in March 1961, Népszabadság, okay. So this is how history works. For those of you that are not immersed in Hungarian politics, that newspaper has just been shut down last week under completely scandalous conditions. So the Hungarians in the room think that this is some kind of provocation. No, I started working on this way long time ago. Anyway, so Népszabadság, the all-important Central Party newspaper in Hungary, made history by opening the first permanent correspondence station of a Hungarian media organization ever in Africa. And the site chosen was Accra, Ghana. The journalist entrusted with this task was György Kalmár. This is a photograph. It was the best photo I could find of him, although it's a little unfair in the sense that this is from the 80s, so he's about 20-something years older here than he was when he arrived in Accra, but imagine this man 20 years younger. He was a senior writer at Népszabadság in the foreign policy desk. He was 35 years old at the time and brought his family with him, including his 3-year-old daughter. They would stay in Ghana until '64, when the mission was effectively concluded. Kalmár had attended university in the humanities in Budapest and had more than a decade's experience in foreign policy journalism, first in the early 50s at the Hungarian radio and since 1957 at Népszabadság. Kalmár's appointment was hardly an isolated event. CTK, the Czechoslovak News Agency, accredited its first correspondence office in Cairo in 1961 with Jaroslav Volček, in the middle of this picture, as its first appointee, and PAP, Polska Agencja Prasowa, the Polish news agency, opened a similar permanent office in Dar es Salaam, capital of then Tanganyika, later to become Tanzania, with none other than Ryszard Kapuscinski himself. This is somebody who would become one of the world's superstar foreign correspondents, portrayed on the left here, covering the so-called Third World. And that is, of course, not even mentioning the numerous Soviet journalists who were covering Africa by then, all over. Today, I will take an empirical route to addressing the problem of socialisms and world history, based primarily on a single piece of extended empirical evidence, namely Kalmár's first book on Africa, written and published in Magyar under the title Arany Ghana, which we would translate to English as Golden Ghana, partly a sort of a hidden pun here, because of course Ghana had been, before independence, it was called the Gold Coast colony of written a little more than 2 years of stay, after a little more than 2 years of stay in Accra in the summer of 1963. It was published in Budapest by Kossuth Kiadó, namely the Communist Party's own publishing house, in 1964. And for those of you that are familiar with the conditions of publishing in contemporary Budapest, you might want to know that this book was published in 8,000 copies and sold. In passing, I will also make reference to one of Kapuscinski's books on Africa, entitled The Shadow of the Sun, which was written at more or less exactly the same time, but published in English only in 2002. It's the English cover page of the English edition. So what I'll try to do today is prompt ourselves to look at a set of excerpts, chosen by me, obviously, from the book Golden Ghana, and also a little bit from Kapuscinski's book, and ask a few questions about the ways in which an unabashedly communist intellectual from the Hungary of the early 60s, a journalist with impeccable political credentials, and a dose of cosmopolitan interest, struggled with his encounter with a set of social, political, economic, and cultural conditions in a part of the world that is definitely outside the core of intellectual life in Budapest, or even the Soviet bloc, really, until then. So my initial questions were very vague, something like, what conceptual challenges emerged from the encounter between the two realities, East European state socialist internationalism and post-independence Africa? And what results did it produce? What came out of it? In this sense, I actually think that this book, Kalmár's book, is a very fortunately chosen example, because it's really fascinating and rich. I very wholeheartedly recommend to all of you who do read Magyar to get a copy and read it. First, I'd like to say a little bit about the context. In order to understand the text, you might want to look at the context. To state the obvious, the very late 50s and the early 60s saw a dramatic increase in the interest in what was termed by then the Third World by the political elites of the East European state socialist societies. For instance, the intercontinental route map of Csész the Czechoslovak Airlines looked like this. This is in 1959. And I don't know if you can read, not a very good quality projection here, but this is only the intercontinental, so there's a lot more flights within Europe, but here's this connection going Baghdad. I can't quite read it, but Bombay, Rangoon, Phnom Penh, Jakarta. That is Czechoslovak Airlines, 1959. And the other one, of course, is going through Rabat and Dakar to Conakry and Bamako. This is probably going to be even worse to read. This is a page from the International Schedule of Aeroflot, the Soviet airline, 1963, which even had a joint venture. There is a venture between Aeroflot on the one hand and the Ghanaian state on the other, called Ghana Airways, which started direct flights between Moscow and Accra in February 1963 using Aeroflot's IL-18 aircraft. The situation was so advanced, in fact, that in April 1963, the journal World Politics carried a piece by an American Czechoslovak area specialist by the name Kurt Beck. You understand here in the height of the Cold War here, arguing with utter horror that the water is safe to drink in Alexandria and Cairo, Egypt, thanks to a water filter station established by Czechoslovak engineers. A shoe factory in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is being built by Czech technicians. Across the frontier in Somalia, Czechs are building a technical institute to teach some young Somalis the techniques necessary to staff modern factories and so on. And fast forward in the smaller villages of Ghana, special trucks are delivering Czech beer to the local inhabitants, and so on and so on. This particular article only speaks about Czechoslovaks, but a set of similar articles ought to have been written about the presence of each and every one of the members of the state socialist bloc societies in Africa, including Hungary, by the way. So let's cut through the chase and let's look at the Cold War a little more close up. The meeting of the 81 communist and workers' parties held in Moscow in November and early December 1960 is widely discussed in the history of the international communist movement because it revealed the deep rifts pitting Chinese and Albanian communists on the one hand against the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and practically all other parties which teamed up with the Soviet Communist parties. The Moscow meeting, this particular Moscow meeting, is relevant to my topic, however, for another reason. The point is somewhat oblique. It is tucked away in a giant 15,000-word joint statement released afterwards, which, by the way, has been eventually signed by all participants, including the Chinese and the Albanians. So here is the relevant section. This statement, as I said, signed by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, China, and all the Soviet bloc plus another something like 70-something communist and working class parties worldwide, stated that the working class movement in the capitalist countries, and here's the rub, the national liberation movement in the colonies and dependencies will achieve new victories. The complete, and here the text itself is speaking in italics, meaning emphasizing this text. The complete collapse of colonialism is imminent. This is spoken in 1960. The breakdown of the system of colonial slavery under the impact of the national liberation movement is a development ranking second in historic importance only to the formation of the world socialist system. Well, I mean, I was thinking maybe first, but second, not too bad. It could have been much worse. So, this had implications, immediate, direct, operational implications for the establishment, political machineries of every one of the socialist bloc countries. The communist parties of the Soviet bloc had an unambiguous charge, and that was to extend a friendly helping hand to the national liberation movements and the newly independent, erstwhile colonized societies of the world. This is the political logic that lies behind the interest in Africa and other parts of the world, which I didn't demonstrate, but it was there as well. There were, however, a few immediate problems. To start with, the so-called Third World was enormous and exceedingly complex. It was really difficult to find East European communist intellectuals who knew anything about any of the hundreds of societies we talk about when we say Third World. Nor was it exactly an intellectual blank slate, as if we expected East European socialist truth to be written all over it. So let's change the context for a moment. Let's rewind our historical tape to 1900. Speaking at the first Pan-African conference held in London, 1900, W.E.B. Du Bois coined the phrase, the color line. He proclaimed that, quote, the problem of the 20th century, speaking on the brink of the 20th century, is the problem of the color line. The question as to how far differences of race, which show themselves chiefly in the color of the skin and the texture of the hair, will hereafter be made the basis of denying to over half the world the right of sharing to utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. I hope you all know who W.E.B. Du Bois was. We're talking about the key founder of theoretical sociology in the United States. In his first magnum opus as a sociologist, the color line became a key theme. This fascinating, beautiful book, entitled The Souls of Black Folk, published at his age of 35 in 1903. Remember, this is 2 years before the Protestant ethic. Du Bois defines the color line as follows, slightly different language. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men. Of course, we're talking about people, but that's the language at the time. Right? Please, let's not get stuck on that for now. In Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. Now, on the face of it, this prophecy can be seen as a straight-line reference to race, quote-unquote, and the US-focused one at that. And that it is, of course, coming from Du Bois, a biracial scholar, a product of both Harvard and Berlin universities, a former student of Sombart, a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the fulcrum of black nationalism in the United States to this day. It is important not to miss the second part of Du Bois's definition and argument. Quote, denying to over half of the world the right of sharing to utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization, resulting from the relation. Did I? No, okay, yeah. Resulting from the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. Put differently, Du Bois was not only an early founder of black nationalism in the United States, but also a lifelong anti-colonial activist and a promoter of the Pan-Africanist movement. And the key aspect of black nationalism, anti-colonialism, and Pan-Africanism, the version at least that he upheld, was not a flat and purely race-conscious, self-referential identity politics, but a plea that the totality of the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of the modern capitalist world must be re-examined, broken down, and reassembled. And he did this in the very early days of the 20th century, at a point where perhaps, with the exception of Rosa Luxemburg, very few European Marxist thinkers dared or bothered to consider this problem. To be sure, the line, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, preceded the first publication of Lenin's geopolitical analysis entitled Imperialism by 16 years. Lenin, of course, ignored it. Now, jumping back to the scholarly language of our day, early 20th century critical social analysis, race, of course, is a complete fiction. There's only one race, human, period, end of story. However, racism is a pervasive social fact, and therefore we must talk about it. So racism denotes the following chain-like linked series of cognitive steps. First, the assertion that humanity comes in separate, mutually exclusive, non-overlapping, naturally given groups. The claim that it is possible to arrange those non-overlapping groups in a hierarchical manner. The contention that it is possible to construct a single such master hierarchy. That is not various different kinds of hierarchies depending on the context of the situation, but there's always a single hierarchy, always, always, always. The allegation that that master hierarchy conforms to a simple color code ranging from darkest to lightest. And finally, the view that, hence, a putatively naturally given single master hierarchy unambiguously links physical surface appearance of humans with their sociocultural moral worth. Now, conceived this way, critical work on race poses a rather fundamental set of challenges to both theoretical Marxism and socialist praxis. Either, as a weak corollary, we have to admit that racism is a fundamental political issue that both Marxism and socialists must address, something they must address front and center. Or, as a strong corollary, we might conclude that race prejudice is not reducible to class. And if race is not reducible to class, that implies that one of the most basic tenets of Marxism need to be recalled. Marxism needs revision. That's the strong corollary of this law. That this was really an issue is indicated by the fact that somebody of the stature of George Padmore, Trinidadian member of the Communist Party of the United Kingdom, a prominent activist on the world scene of Pan-Africanism, brought the issue explicitly to the fore in choosing to title his book, published in 1956, as follows: Pan-Africanism or Communism. Much the same applies to Aimé Césaire's famous letter to Maurice Thorez, in which the brilliant Martinican poet, this is a letter written in 1956, by the way, in response to the Soviet suppression of the Hungarian uprising, just for those of you that care, that's the basic fact. So this Martinican communist resigns from the Communist Party. Why? Because, well, for two reasons. One is he deplores the French Communist Party's blindness with which it follows the Stalinist line, and, equally important, its steadfast refusal to give colonialism and issues of race, quote-unquote, that is the color line, so to speak, their due significance in its policies. All East Europeans who visited the Third World, so to speak, and especially journalists who stayed there, who were stationed there, whose job it was to try to enter into social life and report about it from the ground, were confronted with, quote, race, unquote. Discomfort about their own position, and an acute sense of a gaping hole in knowing how to relate to the race configuration unfamiliar to them from their East European background, suffuses writing by both Kapuscinski and Kalman. Kapuscinski addresses it this way in the chapter entitled, in his book entitled, I, a White Man. I apologize, it's a long quote, but I think it's pretty fascinating and very important for my argument, so I'm going to read it. Okay? Sorry. It was in Dar es Salaam that I arrived as the correspondent of the Polish press agency, and the city in which I was to spend several years. Going about the streets, I quickly realized I was in the net of apartheid. First of all, the issue of skin color suddenly loomed large. In Poland, in Europe, I never thought about it. Here in Africa, it was becoming the most important determinant of my identity, and for simple people, the sole one. The white man. White, therefore a colonialist, a pillager, an occupier. I subjugated Africa, conquered Tanganyika, put to the sword the entire tribe of the man just now standing before me, the tribe of his ancestors. I made him an orphan. Yes, when he looks at me, this is exactly what he must be thinking. The white man, the one who took everything from me, who beat my grandfather on his back, who raped my mother. Here he is before me. Let me take a good look at him. I could not adequately resolve the question of guilt. In their eyes, I was guilty. Slavery, colonialism, 500 years of injustice. After all, it's the white man's doing. The white man's. Therefore, mine. Mine? I was not able to conjure within myself that cleansing, liberating emotion, guilt, to show contrition, to apologize. On the contrary, from the start, I tried to counterattack. You were colonized? We, Poles, were also. For 130 years, we were the colony of 3 foreign powers, white ones too. They laughed, tapped their foreheads, walked away. I angered them because they thought I wanted to deceive them. I knew that, despite my inner certainty about my own innocence, to them I was guilty. These barefoot, hungry, and illiterate boys had the natural advantage over me, the sole advantage an accursed history bestows upon its victims. With rare exceptions, they, the black man, never conquered anybody, hadn't occupied, hadn't enslaved. They could regard me from a position of superiority. I did not feel comfortable anywhere. Just let it sort of sink in for a moment. Okay, and now let's switch to Nkrumah. Nkrumah decided to tackle the issue head-on, expressly addressing his own prejudices. The opening, because you notice that Kapuscinski really is only talking about prejudices, stereotypes, or expectations on part of people in Africa, not himself. So, the opening paragraph of the first chapter in his book, The Golden Grammar, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about here, reads this way. Whenever an acquaintance from Budapest passes by here, and who in Pest isn't an acquaintance, we sit down with a drink and I listen to what they have seen, what and how they like it around here. I repeatedly and impatiently shudder from an uncomprehending remark that would inadvertently offend the people around me. If this happens, I quickly remind myself, even youth adventure novels have not seen a more naive, more romantic traveler in Africa than you, speaking to himself. Your only good fortune is that your curiosity is even greater than your naivety, so you are spared of a lot of disappointment. Hungary is very far from Africa, and this distance cannot be measured by kilometers. Most of us have a very parochial image of Africa. Maybe I just stop here and I'll ask all the Hungarians in the room to remember how they whether and how they voted 10 days ago, whenever it was. Never mind. Okay. Most of us have a very parochial image of Africa. We wink at Negroes, quote unquote, with the same Balmazúi város suspicion. Balmazúi város, for those who are not from here, is a small village in eastern Hungary. As the same suspicion as 100 years ago. Or we try to squeeze our newspaper ideas into the cookie-cutter shapes we brought with us from home. It would take a long treatise to discuss why we have not been able to find a middle course between the colonizer's perspective, for that fortunately we have had no opportunity, and the provincial outlook, for which we have plenty more reasons. Everybody knows anyway that we have for long thought in stereotypes and refused to take notice of everything that would not fit. However, afterwards, when the difficult reappraisal began, Africa was the least of our concerns. Even our neighbors were truly far away from us. First, we needed to discover them as they were. And then again, Africa was changing so rapidly, it was so difficult to keep up with the events, that real recognition would always be left for the next day. At a later point in chapter 1, Nkrumah returns to the problem and turns on the volume even higher. He argues, truth be told, Africa is smaller in our eyes than it really is, than in reality, because we know precious little about it. It wouldn't be a tragedy if we could fess up to it, but we almost never do that. I have met many compatriots of mine and have been struck by how superior they feel about Africa. All too quickly they demean what they see around themselves. From the heights of their European greatness, they quickly disgrace these uncultured, primitive, quote-unquote, people. Had they made an earnest effort to understand the intrinsic laws and hidden values of this rich and flourishing society around them, if they learned anything about their culture, they would speak differently. Of course, I didn't think of all this through during my first night in Accra. Then I didn't yet understand at all the extent to which it matters which African country you arrive in. I saw the black continent, and he uses this expression without quotation mark, without anything, the black continent, lowercase black continent, as it appeared from the air. So I will ask the first set of concluding questions, meaning I'm kind of closing this first part of more or less 2/3 of my paper, something like that, with these questions. What is present in and what is absent from these conversations about self and others, whiteness, Eastern Europe, Africa, and world history? What is present and what is absent? Have Kapuscinski and Nkrumah managed to resolve the problem, even if only for themselves? And also, have we moved past all this? Yeah. The next, and this is, again, remember, this is 1963. The next issue I want to address has to do with the eye of the East European communist intellectual beholder. By the way, this is the earliest Hungarian cartoon I managed to find that addresses the anti-colonial resistance movements and the colonial situation. So, I don't know if you can read it, it's so out of focus. But, tourists from Pest in Brussels, what splendor, how is this even possible? And then literally it says, a Negro from the colonies. Let me explain. 1958. So, I'd like to address the question of the eye of the beholder in the case of the East European traveler. For this, I need to tell you about the book, Golden Ghana, a little more. It's quite a complex book, actually. Starting with the genre, the book has powerful elements of a simple descriptive kind of journalism along the lines of a phenomenally popular, successful genre of travel accounts. So far, not particularly surprising. We would also expect another genre, namely foreign policy and or geopolitical analysis. After all, it is such considerations that had prompted the Hungarian decision makers to go through the considerable trouble, not to mention expense, of sending a journalist, a journalist of the Communist Party newspaper, to report from, of all places, Ghana. Here comes the first surprise. Golden Ghana, the book, is almost completely devoid of such material. Nkrumah arrived approximately 1 month after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of independent Congo. The assassination was carried out by Belgian mercenaries with very active American encouragement, let's put it that way. This story is not even told in the book. The author assumes his readers know about it. He makes a reference to it in passing, but omits it essentially from his writing. During his first year in Accra, Ghana saw a series of terrorist attacks, ostensibly aiming to kill Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah. The issue was so prominent that the British Foreign Office came close to cancelling Queen Elizabeth's visit in 1961. It was very difficult to see the series of bombings as anything but attempts to destabilize Nkrumah's rule and government. Nkrumah reports it in passing as part of a little anecdote tucked in the middle of a mini-portrait of a ranking member of the government who essentially, by the way, was accused of being behind the bombings. There is no discussion of the possible sinister outside imperialist forces or any of the things that you would expect from on the basis of knowing the sort of political culture of the time of the Cold War. On the other hand, the book has a very peculiarly Hungarian or East Central European literary quality. For it is also, or I would even argue primarily, a sociography. Sociography is a peculiarly East Central European, semi-literary, semi-scholarly genre of writing, a mixture of basic ethnographic description, especially economic ethnography, with texts of literary quality and sociological analysis, all provided with an acute sensibility to the plight of the downtrodden. Sociography was the signature genre of the populist movement in Hungary and produced in the between-war period some compelling accounts, especially about the life of segments of society, predominantly the poorest of the peasantry, that were hidden from urban literate cultural practices. The book is, to a surprisingly large extent, a sociographic study of Ghanaian society in the early 60s. To start with, it features a bibliography at the end, listing 41 items that the author has consulted in the preparation of the manuscript. I have never seen a travel account that actually lists scholarly readings as a source. Nkrumah's readings include, of course, the mainstream British works on the Gold Coast colony, but they also include 2 books by Padmore, although very carefully avoiding the Pan-Africanism or Communism book, he lists 2 others, as well as works by Nkrumah. Such Western scholars as David Apter and Jack Goody also found their way into Nkrumah's bibliography. The structure of Golden Ghana is essentially that of a social survey, presented in the eminently readable language of an erudite travel account. There is a special chapter devoted to the land question, the economic and political power of tribal chiefs, the agrarian economy, with special reference to cocoa and timber production, a critical analysis of gold and diamond mining, several detailed descriptions of family structure, the economic role of women, the power of the retail merchant class, and the role of Lebanese and Indian entrepreneurial minorities. Overall, in this regard, the book is suffused with the sensibilities and emphases of what we have come to recognize as, by today obviously, as the dependency perspective. And this is despite the absence of any mention of the word dependency or dependence, or references to the literature on dependent development that was already quite afoot by the time of the writing of this book. For instance, Hans Singer and Raoul Predish's 1949 work on terms of trade, the Economic Commission of Latin America work, ECLA, Paul Barron's 1957 book on the political economy of growth, work by Celso Furtado, Paul Squeezy, or Albert Paul Hirschman. None of that is in the book. As it turned out, Nkrumah's stay in Accra actually partly overlapped with Immanuel Wallerstein's time there. Wallerstein's first 2 books were written partly about Ghana, and he studied Ghanaian history quite intensely. In fact, recently, Wallerstein has published sort of an autobiographical brief note in which he recounts his visit with the ambassador of the Algerian anti-colonial resistance movement, the ambassador of the Algerian resistance movement in Ghana, who was none other than Frantz Fanon, who was also in Ghana at the same time. The book, that is Nkrumah's book, no mention of the fact that Fanon is in Ghana. He even only barely, to the extent of 2 sentences, mentions the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, actually not only is physically in Ghana, but he actually renounced his U.S. citizenship and took up Ghanaian citizenship at the age of 92 before he dies in Ghana. That is only covered to the extent of like 2 sentences. So none of this explicitly finds its way into Nkrumah's book. That is somewhat odd, considering the fact, which Nkrumah does mention, that a very prominent Hungarian development economist by the name József Böröcz was not only already quite involved in dependency-related work, but was in fact a member of the international experts panel that had drafted Ghana's first 7-year plan. under the leadership of the Hungarian-born British Nobel Prize-winning economist Lord Nicholas Cadell. And yet, the entirety of the work suggests very powerfully that its author is orienting himself in the dependency direction, let's put it that way. Its discussion of the gold mining industry or timber and forestry could be read as ready illustrations to dependency theory. Would pretty much work as nice little scholarly papers if he polished them up and wrote it up in English and tried to publish it at the time. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Nkrumah appears to be fully captive to and wrestling with a powerful kind of modernizationism, a perspective that was clearly previous to dependency, and one that suffers from a number of shortcomings that dependency theory, which was later to be generalized into world systems analysis, of course, as I'm sure most of you know, very elegantly rectified. On the most crass level, modernization theory argued that lack of economic progress in the poor parts of the world was due primarily to cultural factors, namely the supposed inability or unwillingness of, quote, backward societies to engage in cultural practices appropriate to the requirements of the modern economy, under which they, of course, meant industry. Considering this, read the following excerpt from Nkrumah's book. One thing I never managed to put in my head. Fine, I understand why nobody allowed or encouraged the young people of Ghana during the colonial times to study engineering. Why it was better for the British that the son of a tribal chief should become a lawyer? He understands that, I guess that's what he means. But why are there no Ghanaian doctors? At the turn of the 60s at least, 1,000 Ghanaian students studied at universities and colleges abroad, but there were not more than 10 among them who studied medicine. It is only in the recent 1 or 2 years that the situation had changed, so that now, just to mention ourselves, young Ghanaians come to study in Hungary as well. And even in Ghana, the clinic of the University of Legon will begin medical training with 30 to 50 students. Unless I'm missing something truly consequential, this strikes me as a textbook kind of modernizationism. Basically, blaming the victim for being culturally unprepared or unwilling to do what they need to do in order to develop. The book, of course, also pursues the cause of industrial modernization throughout, from its excited description of Nkrumah's signature project, which, as we would learn by 1967, not from this book, from history, when Nkrumah was overthrown, was a major cause of his downfall, the Volta hydroelectric power plant, through discussions of Ghanaian class structure. And I come to my closing point here. I apologize that it will be maybe 3 minutes longer than I was supposed to speak. Although he knows that it would be foolish to expect an industrial society with its class imprint, the industrial working class, in a society in West Africa that is 4 years past independence, and almost as if to try to convince himself about this by properly quoting population census data to show that over 2/3 of the gainfully employed in Ghana at the time were peasants, and that the next largest employment category are small-scale market or roadside retail merchants, almost entirely women. Nkrumah seems captivated by the desire to find workers, especially men workers. He visits a gold mine, where the British managers prevent him from meeting any worker. Then he sets out to explore an aluminum wash basin factory. At least there, at last, he manages to befriend 3 workers, Kofi, Kobina, and Kojo, and has a few beers with them. They were among the first to get a job in the factory. Later, they trained others. They knew nothing, said the muscular Kojo, dressed in a white shirt and a straw hat. They had never seen a machine before, talking about the workers that came after them, right? The guys that they trained to become workers. They had never worked regularly 8 hours a day. It was easy to teach them how to use the machines. They are not that hard. But the fact that you must work constantly. But they broke in like we had broken in, Obama interrupts. We become workers, we joined the unions, even our eyes opened a little. This must have really been worth it for Ghana. This is what Nkrumah's voice here. I thought, more than the wash basins they produce. 100 industrial workers produced by the factory in a year. I was overjoyed when they took me to the factory, he says. I had never had regular income before, and now suddenly £9 per month. He makes a face. Then I realized how little that is. Nobody laughs. £9? That's really little. 600 forints. Kojo murmurs. They are now workers, now they want more of everything. Salary, health insurance. Why? Only European workers have a right to that? If I fall ill, I won't get a penny from the factory, and I'll have to pay the hospital as well. Why do I have fewer rights than those who work for the same company in Germany or Switzerland? In 1962, callback continues, Ghana had altogether 350,000 workers and employees out of a population of just under 7 million. And if I only count those who are actually workers in the mines, in manufacturing, construction, electrical works, and transport, the number drops to 170,000. So even if we can't say that Ghana does not have its own capitalist class, but has its own working class, I could still say workers, especially the number of those at the state institutions and enterprises, is constantly increasing. It would be a mistake to deny these changes, no matter how small they are in themselves. So, to conclude, it is quite clear that Nkrumah ran into the contradictions of expectations for development and progressive social structure on the one hand, and Ghana's economic and social class reality on the other. Based on the first context I had mentioned 35 minutes ago, the fact that this was a socialist project of social change in the context of the Cold War, we could easily dismiss it as a case of working class envy. Because the state socialist project, as developed in the Eurasian semi-periphery, required the existence of a specific vanguard political party whose class background was firmly fixed on the industrial working class. This was so much so, it could be argued, that the early history of state socialism, both in the USSR and in much of Europe, Eastern Europe, where the industrial working class was numerically smaller than in Western Europe, where Marx had developed his theory, involved a catching up kind of creation of a working class. So, in this frame of reference, what Nkrumah is doing is search for, be frustrated because of an inability to find, and urge / desire the creation of a new industrial working class, in this case, as it turns out, in Ghana. There is, however, yet another twist to the story, namely that pretty much all other work that had been written on the societies of post-independence Africa did more or less the same thing. Whether the writer was socialist or liberal or conservative, whether the writer was from Eastern Europe or Western Europe or North America. They looked for the working class and tried to invent ways in which to bring it about where it was not in place. Part of this, of course, had to do with the fact that the canonical notion of modernity and modernization theory that mobilized it firmly mapped the idea of progress and development on industrialization. On a less concrete level, the power of the successful industrial modern societies of Western Europe and North America, i.e. the telos that modernization theory is projected, to the societies of the newly independent societies of the Third World, had this one thing in common, the presence of the working class. To sum it up, it is possible that Nkrumah's desire for a socialist future for Ghana coincides to a remarkably great extent with the concerns of Western modernizationist scholarship, at least when it came to class structure. This coincidence, or is it a coincidence, puts a truly ironical twist on the mainstream narrative of the Cold War, which posits the socialist and capitalist forms of modernity as unambiguously opposed to each other. Now, if that's so, what follows from all that for the future?